Hello guys and welcome back to the chess channel, and today I'm going to show you the best first moves for playing with the white pieces. So starting off, we've got the move pawn to a3 and pawn to h3. Just don't play these moves because you're basically just giving the first move to black, and when you're playing with the white pieces you should of course take the advantage. And of course also a3 just doesn't really do anything to the position, so don't play these moves. So what I'm going to do for this video, I'm going to give it a tier. I'm going to give it a good tier, an opening should play, an okay tier, it may be only for players with for certain levels, and a bad tier, I mean just an opening should never play. So a3 and h3 will be placed in the bad tier. Now pawn to h4 and pawn to a4, generally you generally play that just to develop your rook. You should not do that. You should develop the rooks naturally by castling and bringing them in on the central files, like the E and D files. Here. Don't play these moves, they're just bad. They're going to go in the bad tier. Next up, we've got knight to h3 and knight to a3. I don't even want to mention it, but this is just these are bad openings. Just don't play them. You develop the knight to the edge of the board. They don't control as much as if they're in the centre, so don't play it, please. Next up, we've got pawn to g4 and pawn to b4. Just don't play these openings also, they're not very good. g4 is just not a very good move. Same with b4, because it's just, you just randomly pushing a pawn, and they're both not defended. They can weaken your king. And of course, yeah, there is a trap with these openings. However, if your opponent knows how to deal against it, they're just not good openings. So don't play pawn to g4, pawn to b4. Next up, we've got pawn to b3 and pawn to g3. Now, I'm going to put this in the okay tier, because your idea is basically that you want to fianchetto your bishop on the longest diagonal. This opening is definitely not for everyone, as it can be a little complicated to play for some people. But this is an okay opening, and it is very good for certain players who want to study this opening and get familiar and be good with the opening. So pawn to b3 and pawn to g3 is good. Well, not as good, but it's going in the okay tier, as it's good for certain people, but generally it's okay in the okay tier. Next up, we've got pawn to c3. Now, pawn to c3 is an okay move, as you generally want to plan to play pawn to d4, but it's not the worst opening in the world for the white pieces. However, when you're with white, you should really just take the centre, like I'll show you later. But pawn to c3 is an okay move. Pawn to f3 is a bad move. Just don't play it because you're weakening your king, you're stopping the knight developing to its natural squares, and you're giving yourself lots of dark squared weaknesses. So don't play pawn to f3. Pawn to c4 and pawn to f4 are okay moves. Pawn to f4, you're basically fighting for the e5 square with a flank pawn. However, of course, you're weakening your king, and there are a few traps that black can play. And pawn to c4, you're basically doing the same, but with the c pawn. However, it's the queen that's able to develop out on the light squares. These openings are okay, but I think personally they are only for more experienced chess players. But if you know how to deal against traps that you might face, and you've studied the opening well, or maybe because you're at a certain level and this opening is more recommended for you, I'm going to put this in the okay tier. Next up, we've got knight to f3 and knight to c3. This is going to go in the good tier, or the great tier, because you're developing a knight in the centre, attacking central squares. Knight to c3 is less played, as of course your opponent can still play pawn to d5. But even if you play knight to c3 anyways in d5, you can play d4, and you're playing perfect chess. Well, very good chess, shall I say. Knight f3, of course, you stop e5, but it's a fantastic move as you're attacking central dark squares, and knight to c3 attacking two central light squares. So knight to c3 and knight to f3 are good moves. Knight to f3 is slightly favourable, though. Next up, we've got pawn to e3 and pawn to d3. These moves are okay, as they don't ruin the position in any way, and they don't make any weaknesses, as of course you can help develop the bishop out. However, when you play this move, let's say you play pawn to e3, in reality you have to fianchetto the other bishop. you have to fianchetto the light squared bishop. The dark squared bishop, sorry, because let's say your opponent goes e5 and you say you go d4, and let's say you go d5, like no, not d5, like knight to, I don't d6 then, and you go bishop to d2. The bishop doesn't see half of the board, half of the diagonal, so it's not as good. So that's why you'd have to fianchetto the bishop, and it's the same pawn to d3. You'll have to fianchetto the light squared bishop because it will only see half of the board. So of course that's why I'd recommend just going for the fianchetto, because there's an opening called, this is the Nimzovich Larsen attack, and then on the third move you play pawn to e3, which is now okay because now the bishop's already fianchettoed. But pawn to e3 and pawn to d3 are okay moves, and honestly it's not the worst opening, but you should instead play these next two moves, which I absolutely recommend. So the final two I'm going to show is pawn to e4 and pawn to g4. Absolutely fantastic moves. The best two moves for any chess player, beginner, intermediate or advanced, because you put a pawn in the center and you're attacking central squares. And since the pawn is the weakest piece on the board, since it's got the least amount of mobility and it's got the least amount of points, when a pawn takes up territory, basically no piece dares to step on it, or a pawn even. Only a pawn can actually challenge another pawn, because of course knights, bishops, rooks, the queen and the king of course are more valuable generally than the pawn. But I recommend pawn to d4 and pawn to e4. So pawn to e4, pawn to d4 are the best moves to start and study. I recommend pawn to d4 because you can play an opening called the Queen's Gambit or the London system, which are both absolutely fantastic openings, and I'd recommend that you play these. But if you decide to play pawn to e4, it's up to you really. However, with pawn to e4, you may face quite a lot of openings, like pawn to e6, the French defence, pawn to e5, double king's pawn opening, d6, which is the Perk or King's Indian defence, d5, which is the Scandinavian, c6, the Caro-Kann, or c5, the Sicilian, knight to f6, the Alkin's defence, or knight to c6, the Nimzovich defence, or even pawn to g6, the modern defence, or pawn to b6, the Owens defence. There is a lot of openings that you can face with pawn to e4. Same with pawn to d4. However, with pawn to d4, you can play an opening like the London system. You can check out my video on that. And you basically have this system like this. Or there's another one where it's like this. Check out these, check out my videos on the London system, part 1 and part 2. Because you can literally play the London system against absolutely anything. But of course, so summary, the moves you should definitely play is pawn to e4, pawn to d4, and knight to f3, and knight to c3. The okay moves are pawn to c4, pawn to f4, pawn to e3, pawn to d3, pawn to c3, pawn to b3, and pawn to g3. And the bad moves, well, they're the other ones, so don't worry about the other bad moves because you shouldn't play them, and I'm not going to go over them because why study an opening that's not very good. So thank you very much for watching this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe. Thank you, and goodbye.